Good day. I am Vince Macron Macaranda. Now I am presenting to you my philosophical research paper entitled The Beginning of a Happier Life After Death. This research was based from the book of Gustav Fichtner entitled On Life After Death, which it talks about the journey of the soul before birth, during lifetime, and after death. And the question confronted on this research is, what would be the final place of the soul after the existence in the material world? Whether it will cease to exist or continue to exist eternally in the universe? To answer this question, I claim that a virtuous man becomes immortal and attains full consciousness of the mind through union with an ultimate being, bringing the goodness within the spirit. In other words, a virtuous man attains immortality as his spirit becomes part of an ultimate being, and acquired full consciousness of the mind through the goodness within his spirit. To support this thesis statement, my first point, attracting good spirit during his lifetime prepares his own spirit for the incoming life after death. In doing so, man would be influenced by the good attributes of the good spirit because of his desire to seek good with his mind. Developing a man's spirit depends on how he develops his reasoning and determining and desiring good things. And after knowing what is good, application will be followed that will lead him to become a good man by practicing good acts. Through that, the spirit stores the goodness in his memories and continues to develop when it encounters the immaterial world. Because of the good attributes obtained, the spirit can easily connect to the highest of spirits, or the ultimate being. The presence of goodness in the human soul defeats and removes the presence of evil spirit on his soul and directs toward pure heavenly dwelling for blessed spirits, specifically to God, as it brings the virtues and obtained during lifetime. For my second point, the union of the individual spirit in a spiritual body, and through that it will attain the full consciousness of the mind. Since during the lifetime of man, there is a limitation to grasping ideas since the human mind cannot reach some ideas. Man's spirit cannot attain full consciousness because it is trapped in a narrow physical body. When death comes, however, it frees the spirit, bringing the goodness, where there are no longer limitations in attaining ideas, since there will be contact with other intelligent beings. In other words, death is a way of uniting all individual spirits. In that sense, the union of the spirit in a spiritual body happens only when it leaves the physical body. As one of the thinkers says, that the soul will continue to exist in the immaterial world and become united with the incorruptible body, the angels, the good spirits, specifically the existence of God. And in that stage, the individual has the spirit to attain the full consciousness of all ideas, since they became part of the highest of spirits, which is the source of enlightenment. My third point is making connections with the living and with the highest spirits would fully understand the physical world or the whole universe. To be with God does not depend on the senses but on the human mind, where it will witness the perfect happiness in heaven. Since the individual spirit has united with God and has already attained full consciousness, it can now understand the nature of the world by connecting with and being with it. Hence, man cannot appreciate the beauty of hills and meadows and experience unexpected events through their senses and thoughts, but they can truly understand the nature of these things. However, when a man's spirit departs from their body, it gains the ability to connect with and comprehend the true nature of everything by entering to them, including the hills and meadows. On the other hand, spirits can connect to the living through the human minds, which stores everything, including all good deeds coming from others and those coming from good people who have already died. The individual spirit brings all goods eternally after death, while the good deeds he has done during his lifetime will remain in other in other human minds at the same time. For instance, the teachings of Jesus Christ remain today, even if his physical body no longer exists in this world. Thus, it tells us that the human spirit will continue to exist in both the material world and immaterial worlds through the mind, considering the acquired goods and values. However, considering the objections of these supporting points, for the first objection of the first supporting point goes like this, and it starts with a question. What would be the purpose of developing spirits by attracting good spirits if death is the ultimate end? As one of the thinkers says, death is a permanent experiential blank, which implies non existence. In that sense, developing man's spirit by desiring good is not an assurance that it will exist hereafter because of the existence of evil or death as an end. This is the ultimate end, and it defeats the purpose of doing well since there is no other life when death ends man's existence. On the other hand, when man lives an immoral life, he misguides the journey of the spirit towards the highest since he attracts more evil spirits than good spirits during his lifetime. As a result, a spirit attracts death at the end of his existence because of the presence of evil spirit within. Because of that, it is hard to connect with the highest of spirits and it deprives one of attaining full consciousness and full goodness since there is no desire for good. Thus, desiring immortality is risky because it loses the infinite goodness and it only leads to meaningless life. For the second point, the notion of all spirits uniting with the Supreme Being is considered impossible due to the lack of empirical evidence. There is no proof of such union or interaction with the Supreme Being, since it exists beyond the physical world, which cannot be measured or observed by science or any other experiments. On the other hand, the human mind can only comprehend ideas based on sensory perception that leads to every thinker to believe in their existence because they can be perceived. However, the concept of an afterlife is still an issue because senses are incapable of perceiving it, because it is beyond the reach of human mind. Albeit, the mind can conceive the union of spirit to the Supreme Being, but it only exists in the mind since it cannot be observed in the material world. Therefore, providing empirical evidence in proving God's existence is difficult and impossible. Man can't use what he see and experience in the world to prove God's existence because he don't have enough background information to connect these observable things to an invisible God. Says I, it was stated of one of the philosophers or thinkers. For the third point, death ends the existence of human beings, and the spirit will no longer roam around in the material world as it returns to the Supreme Being. As we go back to the third supporting point, it talks about the, the connection of the spirit once he died, since it is making connections again to the physical world. So, in that sense, the ultimate being is the source of all existence, and it implies that once the soul goes back to him, there is no longer connection. This argument emphasizes that making a connection to the living after death by entering the living is unreasonable since the spirit will go back directly to where it came from. One of the teachings of Plotinus says that the other substantial beings, the intellect, or nous, and the soul, which includes the individual souls, come from the one. It is unnecessary to make connections again to the physical world after death since the spirit has already acquired full consciousness with the Supreme Being. Therefore, the individual spirit will continue to exist by being union with the highest, which is God, and no longer have a connection to the world of matter. To answer these objections, For the first point, it says that one of the teachings of Plotinus, he introduces the idea of beneficial end or telos and link it to the God's nature. This concept emphasizes that the telos is aimed at maintaining the intellectual realm, which God is the source of intelligence, rather than being focused on the material world. Moreover, death is not ultimate end, but the beginning of eternity, because the soul carries the virtues that being acquired from the mind that will connect to the Supreme Being. All goodness came from one source, which is God, that emanates toward all beings in both the immaterial and material world. Since God is immortal and goodness comes from Him, the goodness carried by the human soul is also immortal. Thus, it implies that the soul will continue to exist with God because of goodness, which tells that there is an existence after death because of the virtues present in the human soul. Therefore, doing what is good during lifetime has a purpose, and it ends with God. To answer the second objection, since it talks about the empirical evidence. So, the lack of empirical evidence is one of the proofs that God does not exist. But, take note, it is the empirical evidence itself that leads to God's existence. Logically, if there is an existence of the visible world, the visible, the invisible world is possibly exist. It tells that the mind is powerful as it can conceive the ideas that cannot be found in the material world. Hence, if man uses his mind to examine the material world through empirical evidence, it might lead to a conclusion that there is someone who organized and designed orderly the world. According to St. Thomas, the order in the world has a cause, which is the intelligent orderer that says that the world is a product of God's intellect, or God's mind, which is the blueprint of the world's design. On the other hand, one of the thinkers says that there is someone who is a wise craftsman who causes the order of the world because of his rational plan. To answer the third objection, when man dies, his soul enters the world's nature and his good deeds remain in the human mind. The mind retains some good works of the dead person in the sense that by acknowledging the dead's goodness with his intellect, it attracts the spirit of the dead man towards him. Through that, it is clear that through the mind and soul can connect to the living being. Moreover, even if the spirit already goes back to the ultimate being, there is still a connection because we are one reality in one spiritual body. All spirits in the universe, including the spirit entrapped in the human body, are one and connected to ultimate being. The mind and sensation complement to one another in producing knowledge, which makes the soul filled with ideas that links to the world soul, where perfect ideas are found there, or the unified totality of the idealized world. When man dies, there is an intercourse of the spirit between the living and the spiritual realm, which can influence an individual to be a good man or an immoral one. Thus, the mind is the bridge to connect the spiritual realms and the world of the embodied being. And in conclusion, death is a reality and truth, and no one can escape that phenomena. Every living being in the corporeal world ends with death. In that matter, there are people who think that death is bad and evil since it ends the existence eternally. However, there are some people who believe that death is the transition to a happier life because it unions with God if there is a presence of goodness in the spirit. Hence, the mind has the power to distinguish between good and evil by observing its impact in every situation. Through that, I realized that the mind guides us in practicing good acts until they become virtues. And a virtuous man fills with his spirit with goodness, knowing that the source of goodness is God. Above all, the assumption of God's existence molds every person to become virtuous, not doing good acts just because of a reward, but doing good because it is the right thing to do. So, therefore, the immortality of the soul relies on the ultimate being, with eternal consciousness and inherent goodness. And for my insight, I just only give one sentence. For my insight, caring the mind is caring for the soul and life hereafter. Since the mind is connected to the soul, which if a mind know or already grasp goodness, it retains in the soul, and mind is responsible of grasping good deeds or good acts that will restore or retain in the soul. So the question now, so the question for for the incoming research, I have only one question to them. It goes like this: what will happen to the soul who does not attain goodness? So that would be all about my philosophical research paper, and my Privatissimum is done. Thank you for listening.